the Belated Binge podcast.
Hi, and welcome to the Belated Binge podcast. My name's Zach. I'm your host throughout this whole revisiting journey of some of the most iconic series in recent memory that, aside from their impact on pop culture, also have one other key thing in common. I nearly missed out on them completely. When these series were at their peak of popularity, I was nowhere to be found until many years later, sometimes over a decade. That's the belated part. But now that I've come around, they become some of my favorite forms of entertainment. So we're going to revisit them each, episode by episode, chapter by chapter, moment by moment, taking a deep dive into world building, character development, plot holes, theories, themes, and we're going to give away some meaningless awards in each episode. That's the binge part. Together they make the Belated Binge, and today we continue our reread of the Harry Potter series with chapters 3 and 4 of The Sorcerer's Stone, Letters from No One, and The Keeper of the Keys. But first, this podcast will have spoilers. As we dissect each chapter, we're looking at character motivations and key moments that impact the greater story. This podcast also has the potential for some adult language and occasional adult content. We will definitely try not to let it get too far out of hand, but it may happen sometimes. I also want to give a huge thank you to Meg Digital for being our first show sponsor. Meg Digital helps local businesses get new customers through highly targeted digital advertising campaigns. If you or your business is interested, contact Mark at Meg Digital for a free consultation. Just make sure you let them know that you came from Belated Binge. You can email Mark at marc@meg.digital. That's marc@meg.digital. To catch you up, our first 2 chapter episodes covered the first 2 chapters of the series. We're introduced to a few key characters, we've gotten the foundation of Dumbledore's grand plan, and we've gotten to know a little bit about our protagonist, Harry, and his depressing existence with the Dursleys. Also, he can talk to snakes. Today, we cover the next 2 chapters in Sorcerer's Stone, starting with our play-by-play.
Play-by-play.
If you're new to Belated Binge, the play-by-play section is where we give a recap of what happened in the chapter. Play-by-play. In Chapter 3, Letters from No One, there's plenty of funny moments, but nothing really happens. It all basically starts with Harry getting sent to grab the mail. He finds a letter addressed to himself in the cupboard under the stairs, which is hilarious that they knew it was there. But naturally, Dudley is a complete little turd about it, and Vernon won't let him have his letter, shooing both boys out of the room, not just Harry, while he and Petunia completely freak out behind closed doors, thinking that the boys can't see them freaking out. It's a bit odd that they aren't more welcoming of Harry receiving a letter to go off to a boarding school for the bulk of the year. They hate him living there, but it shows they hate the idea of being associated with wizards even more. They'd rather hide and keep him chained to a pipe in their basement than be rid of him knowing he was doing magic. Of course, they suck, so the idea of them keeping Harry from anything that could possibly bring him joy falls right into character. And so the chapter goes on. Vernon is more and more crappy. He's going more and more crazy, trying to keep these letters out of the house and away from Harry. The one positive thing that comes from the first letter is that Harry gets a bedroom instead of a cupboard. So our sophomore Wizard Rock album is officially going to be called Hallways of Doom to the Smallest Bedroom. But they're not doing it to be nice. This is what Vernon tries to pull off in the chapter, and it just falls flat, and even Harry knows that this is crap. They do it because they realize the wizards know how crappy they've been to Harry, and they think if they treat him just slightly less like a prisoner, just a tad more like a living, breathing human, the magic people will magically forget how shitty they've been to this magic kid and decide not to bring him to the magic school. But then, more letters. And more letters. I personally like to think that this is Dumbledore getting just a small bit of pleasure in messing with them. After all, our running theory is that Dumbledore is controlling this entire story, the whole narrative, from off page. And so we're assuming that he's fully aware that they've been treating Harry like garbage for the past 10 years. And now they're trying to keep him from attending Hogwarts. He could have sent someone to the house. He could have shown up himself. He could have just Aloha his way right through the front door and told them all what's up. He kind of does that in chapter 6, or not book 6, rather. But he knows that they're being awful. He also knows that they're afraid. So he's like, all right, go ahead. You want to keep the letters away from Harry? Here's a few more. Oh, board up the letter slot? Here's a few, through the windows. Block those up? All right. Here they are in milk bottles, chicken eggs. I not so secretly hope that somewhere off page Vernon laid a letter himself during his morning constitutional. And when Harry can't get a hold of any of these letters, bam, flood the house through the chimney, letters everywhere. Side note, at this point, someone at Hogwarts, if not Dumbledore himself, has to be thinking, how is this kid completely unable to grab a single one of these letters? Not one. Not one. Oh well. Keep torturing the muggles. It's fun. Oh look, they're running to a motel. Letters. To the point that Vernon has completely lost his mind. He's terrified, he's unhinged, he gets a gun, some snacks, and he forces the family into a small boat, out to a small shack, on a small rock, in a not-so-small rainstorm. And guess what? As Harry's laying on the cold floor, with a moldy blanket, counting down the seconds until it's his birthday at midnight. Bang, bang, bang. Hagrid at the door. The lead single off of our new album. So that's it for chapter 3, really. So then in chapter 4, Keeper of the Keys, it begins with Hagrid knocking at the door. And by knocking, I mean knocking the whole thing down and coming inside. Because that's what you do. This is where we get like a really robust exposition info dump for the story. But first, we have to get some comedy. He's literally a gentle giant, asking for tea or booze, and then ties Vernon's rifle into a knot, which it reads very Looney Tunes, very cartoonish, and, just to be clear about this, he does not mistake Dudley for Harry. I believe this is also the first mention that we get of Harry's appearance, in particular, how he looks like his father and has his mother's eyes, which is something we're going to hear roughly 4,045,486 times before the series is over. Also, he doesn't misspell everything on the cake. Just saying. He introduces himself as Rubeus Hagrid, Keeper of Keys and Grounds at Hogwarts, before discreetly creating a fire and cooking some sausages for him and Harry. This is where things start to get real. When he realizes that Harry has never heard of Hogwarts, he's completely shocked. And at this point, you have to wonder, is this news to just Hagrid, or is Dumbledore also under the impression that the Dursleys would have told Harry about the wizard school like, he intended with that letter in chapter 1 when he left the baby on the doorstep to be kidnapped by anybody? It seems more likely that Dumbledore is pretty aware that they kept this secret by now. Particularly since it was so hard to get Harry a letter, which he still hasn't received, by the way. But Dumbledore just didn't share this bit of information with Hagrid. Why? Was this an oversight? Maybe. But for me, it's a lot more fun to think he withheld this information intentionally for just this moment as part of his grand plan. And we have a theory as to why he would do that. And we're going to dig into that theory over on Theory Corner on Patreon. If you're new to the podcast, one thing you're going to hear about is Theory Corner. This is where we pick either a popular and really interesting fan theory to dive into, deeper, or to expand upon it, or in some cases, they'll just be original theories that are birthed right here on Belated Binge. If this is the type of discussion that does interest you, please join us over on Patreon, where patrons can enjoy exclusive content like this, as well as early access to podcast episodes. There's other bonus content that gets posted to Patreon as well. Some things are just going to be Harry Potter related, Some things are going to be like award banquets at the end of the books. After we get them done, we'll do like a recap episode of all the awards that we handed out and things like that. So it's fun and we appreciate the support. So head on over to Patreon and get that exclusive content. It's also, at least we intended for it to be, priced very accessible. So at this point, Hagrid, who started as a little bit confused, is now just getting pissed. He turns on the Dursleys and begins just shouting things like, this boy doesn't know anything, which Harry thinks is a bit overkill because he's not an idiot after all. He has no idea that Hagrid is talking about not knowing anything about the wizarding world or about his parents and how they were killed, or about himself, truly. He's shocked, he's livid, and thus the exposition begins. He tells Harry about his parents, how he's famous, he tells him he's a wizard. This is the part where we mention that the famous line from the movie isn't actually how it's written in the book. I personally find this way less annoying than other liberties taken in this scene that I've already hinted to a little bit, like, discreetly making the fire, or not mistaking Dudley for Harry. But this is not a movie to book review. We can do that later in the context of their own story and canon. TBD on exactly how we put that together, but that's coming and it's not happening here. So I need to stop. But now, after more than a chapter, Harry finally gets to read his letter, and we get confirmation that Dumbledore is the one who sent Hagrid. We get this because that's who Hagrid writes his letter to say, hey, I got him. He's safe. I gave Harry his letter. We're going to go to Diagon Alley. Everything's cool. So obviously, he addressed this directly to Dumbledore. So it was Dumbledore who said, hey, go get Harry. It wasn't something that was predetermined, at least that we can tell outside of the scope of Dumbledore's grand plan, of course. Because I have to imagine, Hagrid isn't the one making house calls to Muggle-born wizards every day. This is a Harry thing. But we get the information and confirmation that the Dursleys knew that Harry was a wizard this entire time, and that they don't want him going to Hogwarts. We get Petunia calling her sister a freak. We get a real sense of where the hatred for Harry truly stems from for these people, particularly Petunia, who hated her sister, or at least that's how it's presented now. But we know in a reread that this might not truly be hatred. In The Prince's Tale, in the final book of the series, we learn that Petunia didn't always hate her sister, or even think she was a freak. We learn that Petunia was actually jealous of Lily having magical abilities and getting to go to the special magic school. So much that she wrote to Hogwarts herself to request that they let her in too. And guess who responded politely, denying her? Albus, Wulfric, Percival, Brian, Dumbledore. Perhaps this is why Dumbledore would know, or at least think, that Petunia would not only take Harry in as a baby, but might even want to take him in, or at least understand the seriousness of the situation enough to know that it was magically necessary to keep her nephew safe from a murderous lunatic. So is it hatred, or is it jealousy? I might even say that it's hatred born from jealousy, which there probably aren't many stronger forms of negative feelings towards any other human than that, really. The exposition continues. We learn about the car crash lie. Harry finds out that his parents were murdered, and then the tone shifts. Hagrid wasn't expecting to have to explain all this. He assumed that Harry already knew. It was in the letter Dumbledore left on the doorstep. So they would have told him, duh. No, of course not. Now he goes into a whole thing about Voldemort. The fear, the wizarding war, how his parents fought for good, how Voldemort went after them, how he killed them, how he tried to kill Harry, and how he failed. How Hagrid himself took him from the house. And something I forgot was that the Dursleys jumped in and called it a load of crap, basically how the world is better without Harry's parents. And that's when Hagrid began to lose his mind and threatened them with his umbrella, which we know holds shards of his broken wand. More exposition about Voldemort disappearing and how Harry was the reason he was gone. Basically a hero to the wizarding world and to these people that are, hidden away from Muggles. And this is where we see more of Harry's character come through. He immediately doesn't believe it. He can't allow himself to believe that he's special. It's this humbleness that ultimately leads him to becoming a worthy hero by the end of this book series. If he would have just jumped up and been like, "Ha! In your face, Dursleys, I'm awesome, I'm special, I'm amazing," he wouldn't have had the likableness of, the main character of the story, sure, but he also likely wouldn't have had the emotional capacity or maturity later in the story to ultimately sacrifice himself for others. Of course, we can't end this chapter without a note about Vernon getting brave, insulting Dumbledore, and Dudley paying the price with a pig's tail, courtesy of Hagrid's special umbrella. It ends with the Dursleys hiding away, the two of them going to sleep in the living room, I guess, of the little hut, with Hagrid stuffing himself onto the couch, and they have a plan to go get Harry's supplies in the morning. And that's how Chapter 4 ends, and thus how we get into our scouting report.
Scouting report.
The scouting report segment on the Belated Binge podcast is much like the scouting report for your favorite team's best draft prospect or the best player from the team that you're going to be facing in the coming week or in the coming days if you're into sports. If you're into Harry Potter, the scouting report is about deep diving into the character that we choose out of the chapter that we're covering in each episode. One character going into what we learned about them and some of the characteristics that are brought to light in the chapter that we read. Today, we're obviously going to be focusing in on Hagrid. We get a really good look at Hagrid as a character, and 3 things really jumped out as being noteworthy and fun to discuss for this section of the podcast. And the first thing is his affection for Harry. He's genuinely happy to see him after not having any contact at all for a decade. He clearly bonded with Harry when he dropped him off on the doorstep, just like Dumbledore wanted him to. If you've listened to the show to this point, you know our Dumbledore grand plan theory. But Hagrid is legitimately surprised and actually infuriated to learn that Harry was kept in the dark and that he's been lied to about his parents for his entire life. He's visibly upset about Lily and James. Even 10 years later, he shows his admiration and his emotion about them and for them when he's bringing them up and talking to Harry about what really happened to them. He's quick to stand up to the Dursleys when they try to cut Harry down, a natural defender for Harry. And this all lines up perfectly for the position that Dumbledore has put him in on the chessboard. Why is Dumbledore able to have this incredibly valuable chess piece? Hagrid's loyalty to Dumbledore, and that's the second thing that is worth talking about in this chapter. He's there on Dumbledore's orders. He sent the letter to give him a heads up as soon as he gets Harry his letter and as soon as he's got eyes on the boy who lived, the chosen one is safe. What is like the Secret Service? We got the president. That's silly. He's clearly not been given all the information, but he doesn't care. He was happy to walk into a very complicated situation. He shows no sign of frustration toward Dumbledore at all for not giving him the heads up that, hey, Harry doesn't know about anything, as Hagrid would say it. He immediately loses his cool as soon as Vernon insults Dumbledore. After everything that's taken place in this hut, he's held it together at least enough. He's not squashed these people like a bug. He hasn't taken off a shoe, thrown it at their heads. I don't know why he would. He hasn't, I don't know. He's got pockets everywhere. Pockets on pockets on pockets in his trench coat. And he could have pulled one of those rats out and threw them at their face. He could have done anything to these people to physically harm them. And he's not done that up until the point that Vernon has crackpot old fool come out of his mouth. This is when little Duddykins gets a piggy tail. Even after, being expelled, he stayed on to work the grounds at Hogwarts because Dumbledore gave him that opportunity, but also the affection and affinity he feels towards Dumbledore as a father figure. Think back, as we know, we're rereading this series, Hagrid's father died sometime when he was at Hogwarts, before he was expelled. I can't remember the exact timeline. I want to say it was around his second or third year or so that his father passed away. And that's also right before he was expelled. He could have been thrown out into the street. This would have been, a 13, 14-year-old kid, half giant kid, so a little bit more physically ready to handle things that could come his way, at least in the threat department, or having to, hunt for food. But he was still a child that was thrown out of school. His wand was snapped in half. By the way, the only person that we know whose wand was actually snapped in half when they were expelled. Newt still has a wand in Fantastic Beasts. Grindelwald still has a wand. Always, after being expelled from Durmstrang. I mean, sure, they could have different rules, but it seems weird that Hagrid's the only one that we know that's wand has actually been snapped in half. But he could have gone anywhere. He could have done anything. Dumbledore keeps him on as groundskeeper, and he happily accepts, and he seems to love the job. He seems to love the kids. He seems to love Hagrid. Hagrid seems to love Hogwarts, and he seems to truly love being there and being around. And unlike Dumbledore, Hagrid is also an open book. And that's the third thing that really stands out in the chapter Keeper of the Keys, is this openness that he has with Harry. Hagrid opens up the entire wizarding world to Harry immediately. As soon as he learns that this is just information that Harry doesn't have at this point, he goes. It's exposition time. It's time to bring this boy up to speed. You deserve to have this information. He doesn't hold back anything to not upset him. He doesn't talk around things or try to pass the buck to someone else to bring him up to speed later. He just tells him what's up. He straight up tells Harry, hey, I'm not allowed to use magic because I was expelled from Hogwarts. So, maybe don't rat me out when you get there because pink umbrella and piggy tail. But he catches plenty of crap in this book and in future books and from people in this fandom for being overly forthcoming and letting things slip as the series goes on. But when everyone else is hiding things from Harry, when people are straight up lying to Harry, we plant the seed right now for one adult character in this story that's going to actually tell him stuff and actually give him information when he doesn't have it. And we get that in Hagrid, and it all starts right here. He's a very interesting character study from these books. He has plenty of flaws. He has plenty of fumbles along the way, but he's loyal. He's protective, and he's a great confidant for Harry to have. Maybe not father figure, but a really, really cool crazy uncle. With that, let's get into our foreshadow segment.
Foreshadow.
The foreshadow segment on the Belated Binge podcast is where we quite literally do that. We look at 4 moments in the series that we want to, or in the chapter, I guess you could say, that foreshadow something to come later in the series. And for this episode, or this couple of episodes, chapters 3 and 4 of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, we kind of boiled it down. There's a little bit of a theme to them that is interesting and what honestly wasn't intentional, but a lot of these are quotes. And the first one is, "Don't think he had enough human left in him to die." This is Hagrid talking to Harry about Voldemort and why he just vanished after trying to kill Harry as a baby. And this is 100% a Horcrux foreshadow. Voldemort split his soul into several pieces to become immortal, less human. We're in book 1, chapter 4 at this point, in a 7-book series arc. We already get a hint at how the big bad did what he did and what our heroes will have to contend with in order to beat him. And it's not going to happen for, seemingly ever. The second thing is that we learn that he was expelled in this chapter as well. This is a key plot point for the next book when we learn, why he was expelled. He was framed by Voldemort, by the way, for opening the Chamber of Secrets. The death of Moaning Myrtle before she was moaning Myrtle in the bathroom, and his, let's call it a vacation to Azkaban, that all happened in the second book. And it makes it all that more heart-wrenching when we learn in the second book that he was innocent all along. He could have been doing magic. Not only that, he could have continued his career and his education at Hogwarts. Maybe he would still be the groundskeeper. That's possible because he likes that job. Or maybe he would have gone straight into a job, with a little bit more panache. Or maybe it wouldn't have been so long for him to just become a teacher. If that's what he wanted to do, he would have had so many more options. And probably a lot fewer people who were looking at him sideways and as lesser than them, knowing that he's already different. He's a half giant, whether he says it out loud or not, because of the connotation that it holds in the wizarding world. He still is. He looks different than everybody else. And these people know he's not allowed to do magic. He doesn't have a wand. He was expelled. He did something bad. He's scary. He's big and he's scary. That's ultimately what ends up, I think, happening to him in probably the majority of public eye. We know the characters that we get to know in this series don't treat Hagrid that way. But I'm sure in wizarding society, that's very common for him. And it's all because of this frame job and the fact that he was expelled. And that sucks. But it is a foreshadow. The third thing was another quote. "I was the only one who saw her for who she was, a freak." This is Petunia finally opening up about her sister, the witch. She despises her. But of course, as we mentioned earlier, we learn later in the series that Petunia was actually jealous of Lily being magical, and she wanted the opportunity to go to Hogwarts too. This is jealousy that grew and grew into the awful human that we see in these chapters. But the foreshadow here is what we learn later in The Prince's Tale about that exchange and her familiarity with the wizarding world. And not only that, but her familiarity with Snape as a character and her familiarity with things to come when she surprises us, like knowing who the Dementors were and having genuine, genuine fear when she kind of comes to grips and has that moment of like, so this Voldemort guy is back? Like, she feels that. Whereas Vernon thinks it's just like some wacky cartoon character that's not worth his time. The fourth thing that we want to foreshadow for this episode is another quote. "Nobody lived once he decided to kill him." Bad Hagrid impression, but that's his quote to Harry explaining his parents' deaths. We later learn how Harry survived, of course, through Lily's sacrifice, why Voldemort went after him in the first place, the prophecy, and of course, how Voldemort survived that rebounding killing curse through the Horcruxes. So it's one little sentence, and it foreshadows so many things to come and holds a lot of weight. And these are just 4, there are these Easter egg moments littered throughout all of the chapters in this series, and we're going to talk about a ton of them in this foreshadow segment, but because it's not a 12 shadow or a 15 shadow, we're not going to catch them all. So if anything stands out to you and you have any foreshadows that you would like to share with us, go ahead and let us know. You can get a hold of us on social media. You can email the show at belatedbinge@gmail.com. We're legitimately interested in what you have to say and things that you pick up on during this reread that we maybe don't share in the foreshadow segment or in our next segment, which I think is also something that would be very interesting to get more of your opinions on, and that is our game.
A Game of Inches.
The Game of Inches segment on the Belated Binge podcast is where we dissect a decision that happened or that was made during the chapter and what kind of ripple effect that had on the series had it been made just slightly different. What if a character didn't do one thing that they did, and how might that snowball and change what happens at by the end of this series? And so the scenario that we want to play out in today's Game of Inches is, what if Harry read his letter in the hallway before he brought the rest of the mail into the kitchen? It's not crazy to think he'd be excited. Nobody's ever written to him before in his life. Why not just open it right there and check out what's inside? It sounds like, oh, well, we wouldn't have gotten all of this fun that happened in these next couple of chapters. But I wonder, sure, we miss out on comedy. We miss out on a Vernon nervous breakdown. They probably wouldn't have ended up in a rock in the middle of the sea, but would the Dursleys have been honest with him if he came to the information himself? Would they try to play it off as some kind of sick prank because witchers and wizards aren't real, little boy? You're just being silly. Don't ask questions. Don't, have an imagination. Don't eat more than crackers and cheese. Don't exist. Please. They're awful. But what would they do? How would they have handled Harry bringing them this information? Would Hagrid have still had to come to the house, to get him just from there instead of out on a rock? Would the school have known to send somebody when Harry didn't respond? Would they have just, assumed that he read the letter? They would have to know that he at least read the letter, because otherwise that's why they kept sending them. It's not because he didn't respond. It's because they knew he didn't read it, right? Please respond via owl is one of the things that the letter said at the end. If he just doesn't respond, do they just assume he's not coming? They wouldn't have to send a million more letters, but would the Dursleys, they wouldn't let him go, right? They would never let him just go if they felt like they had any choice in the matter. In fact, would Harry have even believed it himself? He had a hard enough time when an 8-foot tall half giant told him he's never going to believe some random letter that came from some school he's never heard of. Would he have ever made it to Hogwarts? Of course he would. He's the main protagonist in our story, but how? Would Dumbledore have come and gotten him? Would this be we have to believe it wouldn't have been Harry Potter and the Dusty Cupboard. That's a short story that lives on, I don't know, Hulu short, or I don't know what. I'm an old man. Rock, chisel. This owl delivery would be way better for me than trying to remember all of the different streaming sites that I have access to. It's a nightmare. Anyway, we have to have a 7-book, mega series, right? So obviously he has to find his way to Hogwarts, but he's the boy who lived with muggles. So presumably someone was going to have to come and get him to get things to go, right? Even if it was Hagrid, assume he read the letter. Assume he had reservations and reacted in the same way that he did when Hagrid told him, I'm not special. I'm Harry. I can't be a wizard. You have the wrong address. How did you know I'm in the cupboard under? What kind of sick joke is this? Who's sending this? Is this Piers? That I feel like that would be in character for Harry's response to this. So even if Hagrid showed up at the door, would Harry feel the same bond for him or the same fondness if they didn't share the moment the way that they did get to share it? Or would he just be, some big scary looking dude who took him to get his books instead of, the big friendly giant that defended him against his crappy aunt and uncle and defended his parents and showed that emotion and showed that reaction and showed that they're truly allies and showed that he truly cares about Harry. Harry needed that, I think, to build up the trust of not only Hagrid, but I think it probably cemented or at least allowed the cementation. Is that a thing? I don't know. I think it allowed him to trust the wizarding world the way that Hagrid showed up as a defender. And I think that made a big difference for how Harry perceived this whole introduction to the wizarding world from the beginning. I don't know. That's obviously not the story that we get. We have the story that we have and that we get to enjoy rereading, but it is still interesting to think of how things could be different if, again, just one small thing, one small decision was changed and what kind of ripple effect that could have. Before we get out of here, let's give away our meaningless awards. Today, we are going to start with the Game Ball.
The Game Ball.
The Game Ball Award on the Belated Binge podcast is where we just, all we're doing here is commemorating our MVP for each episode. And for this one, I don't even think I need to say it. It's Hagrid. Duh. He finds Harry on an abandoned rock. He gives him valuable information that he had been withheld for his entire life. He opens up his world to a new and exciting future, also terrifying. He rescues Harry. He's the lost relative that comes to save him that he had hoped for in the last episode. They aren't blood related, but they are family. So the Game Ball goes to Hagrid. Now, how about the red card?
Red card.
The red card award is for the character that we want to get out of here. We want to disqualify them from the rest of the book if we can help it, but obviously it doesn't work that way. So let's just say they suck. This is Vernon. He's the worst. He's treating Harry awful before he gets the letter. He tries to stop him from getting the letter altogether. He drags his family around the entire continent, it seems, and off somewhere in the middle of the sea. I mean, we get the impression that the motel that Vernon takes them to is the type of place where you don't want to be when it's dark out. And I'm not going to, I don't want to say too many things like drugs or prostitution on this podcast, but it's one of them shady kind of places. And he tries to get there just to escape some letters showing up at his house because he doesn't want his nephew, Wizard Boy, going to wizard school. He's awful. They are related by blood. They are not family. And when Hagrid does show up, he's incredibly rude. He's incredibly disrespectful. He's, threatening to shoot him, I guess. Although, again, very Looney Tunes. We get the tying the shotgun into a pretty little bow, which is, I guess, funny in some weird way. But he's the worst, not just to Harry. He's the worst to Hagrid. He's the worst to his family in this couple of chapters, and he just sucks. So it would be really great if we could throw him out of the game, throw him out of the books, throw him out of the series completely, because Vernon has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. That leads us into our final award for this episode of the Belated Binge podcast, which is our Fumble Award.
Fumble.
The Fumble Award is where we, instead of looking at characters in the story, we look at the story itself, and we look at the text, we look at the things that happen, and where does the chapter or chapters that we're covering, where does it kind of drop the ball? That's where the Fumble Award comes from. And for this one, we have a couple of things. Lily and James, head boy and head girl at Hogwarts back in their day. We learn later that Lupin was actually the prefect of their year, not James. So, unless I'm mistaken in my Wizarding World knowledge, which I could be, it's very possible. I like this. I like this story. I like this fandom. I like some of the companion stuff that goes with it. I like Harry Potter. I like that I've kind of turned into a Potterhead at this point in time, but I'm not all-knowing. I am not a encyclopedia for the Wizarding World. I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure that you can't be head boy without being prefect first. So how is it possible that Lily and James were head boy and head girl at Hogwarts back in their day if James was never a prefect? I think this is probably just an oversight at the beginning of a story that was still being fleshed out and probably wasn't known at this time how large and expansive it was going to go, and some of these rules just didn't exist in the author's head yet. The second thing is similar to that. It says Hagrid says that he flew out to the rock in the sea, but there's no detail to that. There's no come again by Harry, and we get a little bit of exposition on how that actually physically worked. But later on in the series, he's too big for a broom. Only Voldemort and Snape in the canon of the books are able to fly on their own without, broom or other means. I have to come to the conclusion that this might have been a particularly strong Thestral because he does, breed the group of Thestrals that are at Hogwarts, and Dumbledore does fly on Thestrals to go places sometimes, and our heroes in book 5 fly on Thestrals to go to London. So there is some canon to that. It gets a little bit tossed on its head for the 7 Potters when he shows up on the motorcycle. I don't think it's expressed directly that Hagrid is too big for a Thestral, but perhaps Hagrid and Harry riding on the same Thestral is too much for a Thestral to handle, and maybe this is a special Thestral that was able to take him to the rock. We don't really know, but Thestral is my best guess. However, I do like this little thought that came to me right before recording this episode, and that is, what if it was Fawkes the Phoenix? This is a mission from Dumbledore. Fawkes is Dumbledore's Phoenix. Phoenixes can lift extremely heavy things. 8-foot half giants are extremely heavy things. I'm just saying, there could be something here, and it's kind of fun to think about, but I think at this point, again, the author just hadn't really grasped the rules of flying for this world quite yet, so it was left kind of intentionally vague, and it didn't quite hold up for the rest of the series. That's just my guess. I could be totally wrong. Feel free to let me know what you think. With that, we've reached the end of this episode of the Belated Binge podcast, so thank you for listening, as always. Shout out to our producer, Jack, who we always work like a dog. Remember to follow and subscribe to us wherever you get podcasts. Leave us a review, 5 stars, please, if you enjoyed the show. Become a patron over on Patreon for early access and exclusive content that we have over there. We're also on social media at Belated Binge on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Our show segments are available on YouTube, and we want to hear from you. So leave us a comment on any of those places. You can slide into the DMs, or you can email the show at belatedbinge@gmail.com. If you're reading along, next week we're going to tackle. We are going to tackle Chapter 5 of Sorcerer's Stone, Diagon Alley, which is a big chapter, so we're only doing one. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on the Belated Binge podcast.